Good to have everyone here. Amen. All right, this is it. This is the last sermon in this Samuel sermon series, the rise and fall, looking at those kings, and it's been a good time. But we got to, for this last one, it's actually ending kind of fitting. I don't know if it's ending fitting for you guys, but it's fitting for me, and that's really what this is about. All right, like it's fitting for me, because this title actually means a lot to me personally. So David, a Christmas story. And to explain to you why this title is so important, one of the things that I've always desired since I've been on the path to becoming a pastor, in seminary and all, is kind of being able to communicate the scriptures in a way that is like new and fresh, and that you could see the stories in a new light. My goal is, I've never heard this before. I can't, why has no one ever told me this before? That's kind of my goal. And the reason why that's my goal, because that often happens to me when I'm reading. I'm like, what in the world? Like all those things. The first time that really happened to me was right at the end of seminary, the beginning of my first call, the first church that I was serving at Faith in Bentonville, Arkansas. And there was a realization that I had while reading, and I created my first big sermon series at that church was called Exodus, a Christmas story. Right? And for those of you that have been here a few years, you're like, I've heard that here because, yeah, I rehashed it here when I came here. That was probably 4 or 5 years ago now. But Exodus, a Christmas story, and basically what it is that we walked through the Christmas story in the Gospel of Matthew, and it mirrors the Exodus story of Pharaohs and Moses and taking out of there. And the thing is, though, is that it never says like, oh, hey, this looks like Pharaoh. Matthew never says this looks like this or that. He never points it out. And one of the reasons why I like to have stories like that is because when little Cris was growing up, and listen, little Cris wasn't the brightest. You need to understand that, right? I've made huge improvements, and some of you are like, you still need to have a lot of work underneath you, right? That's a huge improvements, but people would say, oh yeah, the Bible is constantly prophesying about itself, right? And they're like, the Old Testament just talks about Jesus constantly. And I'm like, cool, where's it at? And then someone would show me like one verse in Zechariah. I'm like, about he'll come to the city of David or something like that. I'm like, cool. Is there anything else? Yeah, there's this one verse in Isaiah. Cool. And it always kind of made me feel wanting a little bit. That's why when I found Matthew and how the beginning story never talks about the Exodus, but it sounds like it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. The stuff that I'm talking about today, at the end of 1st and 2nd Samuel here, I would not have been able to preach this sermon a month ago. But because of Bible study and all that stuff, Bible study is pretty cool, is it not, Ed? Yeah, it's other. We got other people too, that are part of it. It's fun, and we found stuff out at the end of Samuel here that I had no idea existed before. And as I further studied it afterwards, I was like, this is David, a Christmas story, right? And so I just wanted to, before we really get going, I wanted to tell you what it means to me, and what this means. Whenever the first time I preach something big that's important to me, it means I haven't quite figured it out yet, and it might be a little boring. Don't worry, when I re-preach this another 3 times, it'll get better, all right? So just buckle up. This is how it's going to be. But before we get into the Christmas part, we need to get you to the point where the Christmas part will actually mean something, right? We got to get you to that point. So the whole idea behind the Samuels, like 1st and 2nd Samuel, is that the main idea is this, that God lifts up the humble, lifts up the lowly, and humbles the proud, right? That both King Saul and King David, both are very kind of small when they begin. And God lifts them up, and then they're like, I'm king now, I am awesome. And it's just like a downward spiral all the way down. And we see that David is that this perfect archetype that he is this, he's this shepherd, right? That he's shepherding his people, and he's this good shepherd. He's watching over the sheep. Then David, we see a turn with that story of Bathsheba, that David all of a sudden turns and he's like, well, what can I get from the sheep? Right? He's like a bad shepherd all of a sudden. And he's like, there's a sheep out there called Bathsheba. Like, she looks pretty good. And it's like, oh man, well, we need to kill Bathsheba's husband now. And it ends up spiraling into this grief spiral that we talked about last week, and ends up with Absalom, his son Absalom, and his own sons are dying, and everything's just awful, right? And this is kind of how the story works. And we get to the ending part of the book. And the ending part of the book is weird, odd. It's chapters 21 through 24. We're not going to go through all of it, but we are going to go through 24. But in 21, there's the stories, and it's presenting David in a very specific manner. There's these stories about David and his fighting men, these men of valor, and they are like gallivanting around, like brave Sir David, brave Sir Rob. Never mind. All right, but they're gallivanting around the countryside, and then suddenly there's a battle. One of Goliath's offspring, one of the Goliath's sons, wants to fight David. And David's like, sure, I can fight him, whatever. But his mighty men block him from fighting Goliath's offspring because they're too worried about it. And David's kind of worried about it too, right? Over there. That they're worried that he's too weak now, that he's not the David of old. Like, David just doesn't have the panache anymore, right? Like, he doesn't have that. And so they tell him, you need to sit out this battle. Now, when David defeated Goliath, was he all that powerful? No. What's the difference now? David has something to lose, right? The pride has gotten to him. The pride has gotten to him. And so then this happens, and then his mighty men don't even let him come out to battle anymore after that. He's not going to any of his battles. He's just sitting in his palace. And then there's this weird moment in chapters 22 and 23 of Sam, where it's like this medley. Yeah, that's what it is. Like a combination of a bunch of different songs. It's kind of that all these different psalms and songs that David has written. It's kind of over there, and it's kind of a short song summary of the book of Samuel. And it talks about some humbleness here. It talks about David winning battles here. It kind of talks about all of it together. And then we get to the last chapter, and this is the one I want to talk about. Okay? Because it goes weird. And it goes in a weird place right away, right? This is the last chapter of Samuel. So are you ready? Let's get weird with it. This is chapter 24, verse 1. So again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. It's always good when you start a story with the anger of the Lord burning against you, right? Like against Israel. And he incited David against them, saying, go take a census of Israel and Judah. Like this strikes me in a couple different ways. One, like the anger of the Lord burns against Israel, and God like forced David to do something. What that to me sounds like, and you guys may think that I'm deluded on this and all that stuff, and that's fine. But it kind of sounds like Pharaoh to me. Remember when God hardened his heart and he didn't let God's people go? This kind of sounds like that to me. But get on to this. This is what upsets God. Go and take a census. Does God not like counting? Is Sesame Street in trouble? That's why the count is like Dracula. He's bad, he's evil, right? Like he's always counting. Does God not like census? It's like, oh goodness, this country does a census every 10 years. we count how many people are in worship every Sunday. Oh no, right? Like it's all evil. Like no more counting, right? Like no more counting. You go up to the restaurant after church, right? And you're like, I refuse to count the money. I refuse to count it. No census, right? Well, what's actually happening? It's weird, is it not? Yeah, it's odd. And so what's the very next verse? It actually tells us what's going on. So the king said to Joab, that's like his general, and with the army commanders with him, go to all the tribes from Beersheba to Dan and enroll the fighting men so that I may know how many there are. Oh, here's the problem. What is going on with David right now? His men aren't letting him out of the palace. They've got him. He's still king, but he's just in the palace and people are like fanning him and he's eating grapes. He's like, I need to be on the battlefield. And so he's like, we need to count this census to know how strong I am, to know how mighty I am, to know how good I am, right? Like it's counting your money again for the third time, right? Like it's like, yes, like this is how things are going for me. But yeah. So like that's what's happening there. Like it's this odd phrase. Like he's no longer that little shepherd anymore. He needs to count his people. And David, to keep the story moving, we go to verse 10, he realizes how bad this is. And David, conscience-stricken, after he had counted the fighting men, he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. This is an odd story. So the census is bad. He's counting like his pride, all these things. And he even like does the David thing of admitting his sin to God. And he's like, what? Like take away the guilt that I have over this issue. And God sends Gad to David. And he says, you need to do penance. Now, I don't know anything about penance, but I know a lot of you are old Catholics. And I hear you talking about getting penance every now and then. And then he gives them 3 options. He goes, you got to do one of these 3 things. And so Gad said to David, with the first options you have, in the land that you exist in, you can have 3 years of famine. All right? Or you can have option 2, 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you. That sounds familiar. Remember when like David was having to run from King Saul and running on throughout all the land? Or the last one, 3 days of plague in your land. Now, if you were a good shepherd of your people, which one of these would you choose? 2, right? 2. I'm getting a lot of 2s. Does anyone disagree? No one will, publicly. Like that's and so like that's but that's 2 seems like if you're being a good shepherd, 2 is the one that kind of seems obvious. Now that's going to be rough on David personally. Like it's like I get it. I'm in my 40s now. Running is hard. My knees hurt. Like immediately start wheezing. And it's like I haven't even started running yet. You know, like there's just that whole thing, right? Like it's difficult. It's difficult. And he's gonna have to be on his run, and he probably has like PTSD about having to run from Saul all those years. It's over there. But do you know which one? So that's probably the best shepherd one because that would affect the people the least. But you know which one David actually chooses? He chooses the 3rd one. And if you remember from the reading that Coley did a little bit ago, it caused 70,000 people to die, right? Like so many, the plague just fell on his people. And I kind of think this one, because David's kind of in an all in almighty place, this one probably would affect him the least, right? He's probably not going to get the plague. And this one's probably going to affect him the least. So this guy who's supposed to be a shepherd is now, we see him continuing to fall and continuing to serve himself in these other things as he chooses 3 days of selfishness as he goes over there. And David again realizes how awful this is that he's done. And he's like, I can't believe I did this again. Oh no. And he sees that God is over by this threshing floor, and he buys the threshing floor, buys the sacrifice. And this is the last verse. There is no more verses after this verse in Samuel. Ready? And David built an altar there on that threshing floor that he buys to the Lord, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered his prayer on behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped after 70,000 people died. And that's how it ends. Cheery, huh? That's kind of like reading a children's book. Like, have you ever read any of those children's books from like the 1500s to your kids? And it's like, and it ends and everybody died. Good night. like, all right, like that. That's how this book ends. Like, that's how David ends. I was never taught that that's how David ended. I was always taught that David had kind of a good ending. He doesn't. Like, it's kind of, David has this huge fall, and then God kind of relents from the plague. What in the world? What an odd story. And this is what this book is all about. This book exists in this realm. And we saw it, if you remember from the beginning, we saw that there were two patterns at the beginning of this book. You had Hannah's pattern, and you had the pattern of Eli. And Hannah was this wife who didn't have any kids. That should ding in like, ooh, that sounds a lot like God's people, right? Like, Hannah didn't have any kids. She didn't have anything. She prayed devoutly to the Lord that she would have a son. That she would have a son, that her shame would be taken away from her. And she prays to God, and God delivers for her. He gives her a son. And when she delivers that son, she ends up giving the son back to the Lord. There's a lot of times when it's like, God, if you just give this to me, if you do, I will do this for you forever. And then we get it, and we're like, ooh, that seems like a lot of work to keep on doing that. Like, she actually went forward with it, right? She gave her son back to the temple, and that's Samuel. So her son was Samuel who came up there, and while this was all happening, she ends up saying this beautiful poem, this beautiful song, and we call it the Song of Hannah. And this is just part of it, but you can see the pattern of Samuel coming out in it. She said, the Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He sets them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. You can hear it, right? Like, it's that the Lord lifts up the humble and he brings down the proud. Like, this is what Hannah's thing is about. Then the other pattern was the pattern of Eli. Remember, Eli, we're introduced at the beginning of Samuel, is that he's the priest. He's the priest. He wears glorious robes of white and green, and everyone is just like, oh my goodness, the priest is so great. I get it. Oh, that sounds like me. Okay. But he's over here, but he doesn't actually know what God sounds like. Like, and this is evident in a couple things. Like, that time when Hannah is fervently praying to God, he sees her fervently praying, and he nudges his buddies like, she's drunk. And then there's this time after Samuel was born, and Hannah gives Samuel basically to Eli. Like, he doesn't know what God sounds like, because Samuel's sleeping one night, and God goes, Samuel, Samuel, and Samuel wakes up. And he's like, oh, man, goodness. He goes over to Eli. Did you call me? And he's like, no, I didn't call you. You had too much matzo ball soup or something like that. I don't know. Like you had too much food, too much indigestion, right? Like that's go away. Like, and it happens 3 times. That's interesting, number 3. But it happens 3 times. And it's almost like Eli doesn't know what God sounds like. And also, Eli's family is a wreck. His sons are terrible. They're taking advantage of people's sacrifices. Like that, he's looking at people like, man, look at that brisket that person's about to put on the sacrificial table. And they're like, you can give it to God, just don't put it on the table. Give it to us. And that's what his sons are saying. They're taking advantage of people's sacrifice. So you have this idea of using God for your own means. That's like the kings and Eli. And then Hannah, where God is lifting up the humble, going on there. And the story goes all the way through till we get to the end that we just went over with David's failures, that we meet him in that failure. Now, let's get to Christmas, because that's what this book is all about, that rise and fall. You need to understand something about people back then. The Pharisees and the leaders of the law, they had the Torah memorized, right? They had the Torah memorized. So like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they would just be able to rip it out. And they probably had most of the prophets and the writings memorized too. These guys knew this stuff like the back of their hand. And just the general normies, I asked this in the first service. Let's see how you guys do. Does anyone have a book of the Bible memorized? Nobody? So usually in a room, there's someone that's like, I got Philippians memorized. Like, good job. It's one of the shorter ones. Like that's, that's, and like these guys have huge amounts of stuff that's memorized, right? And they know this. And just the general normies, like you and I, they like with their bar mitzvahs, and it's just their culture. They knew all these stories about like King Saul and David and Solomon and all these stories. They knew them like the back of their hands, right? They knew them so well. That's why when all of a sudden we come up on the Gospel of Luke, all this stuff is super, super interesting. Whoops. Because when you look at the Gospel of Luke, it begins with the story about this guy named Zechariah. And Zechariah, he's a priest around there, and you're kind of like, oh, Eli was a priest, but there were a lot of priests back then. And you keep on listening to Zechariah's story, and he's in the middle of doing his priestly work, and then an angel shows up all around him and says, Zechariah, even though you are super old and your wife is super old, you guys are going to have a son, and you're going to name him John. And what does Zechariah do? You guys remember the story, right? Does he believe the angel? No, he doesn't. What does that sound like? Sounds like Eli. Sounds like Eli. Sounds like he doesn't know what the sound of God, and Zechariah's not able to speak after that. And you continue on in the story, and Elizabeth ends up being with child, and she has this child, and she gives birth to the son, and everyone is standing around after she gives birth to this miracle baby, you could say, and they're standing around like, what is his name? We think we should name him Zechariah after his father, and his father goes, no. And he writes it on a stone, on a tablet. He says his name is John. Listening and trusting the angel of God, and his tongue is loosened, and it's basically this testament that John comes into the world not like Eli's terrible sons, but John is a voice crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, and he's the one that actually tells about Jesus coming. And then the very next story after that, you have Mary. We're introduced into Mary, right? And Mary, the angel comes to her and he says, you are going to hold the Messiah. You are going to give birth to the Messiah over there. And then she gives this beautiful song. We call it the Magnificat. I don't have all of it here, but I have some of it. And it says, Mary says, my soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For he has been mindful of my humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed. He has performed mighty deeds with his arms. He has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. Wait a second, this sounds like Hannah's song. He has brought down the rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things and has sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful. We've always connected Hannah's song with with Mary's song there. And you see these old readers would have been like, oh, this is interesting. This is interesting. We have this guy that kind of looks like Eli. Now we have this Hannah coming in. And then we have Luke chapter 2, verse 1. All right, let's see how you guys are doing. This is like the first verse of the Christmas story. Does anyone remember what it is? Putting you on the spot. What? In those days? Yeah, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census would be taken in the entire world. That's fun, isn't it? A census would be taken. Wait a second. Do you realize how angry I am that I've always wondered, why in the world does Luke begin with the clever plot device to get Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, right? Just a clever plot device. Oh, let's create a census like over here. But what if it's quoting David? What if it's quoting the end of 2 Samuel? Because I think it is. It's a census just like David did. And it's calling back not to the righteousness of David, not to the glory of David, but it's calling back to the bottom of David, that God still works even through the bottom of David's thing. Because if we continue reading it, it doesn't mention census once, it mentions it twice. He wrote it down again. This is the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. And if you still were too dense that you weren't able to pick up what's going on, like Luke is holding our hands. The fact that I haven't gotten it till this month is shameful on me. He's holding our hands. He's like, listen, this is all about David. He goes, so Joseph went up from the town of Nazareth to Galilee to Judea to Bethlehem. And in case you didn't understand what was happening, to the town of David. Because he belonged to the house and the line of David. And he went there with Mary, who was pledged to be married with him and was expecting with child. And while they were there, I love those verses. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. I love this story because it's all about Jesus coming into the world, and that it's meeting that story of David, that promise of David, not in some high point in David's life, but it's in the lowest of the lows. And you know how you can tell? By what comes up next. And she gave birth to her firstborn son. And she wrapped him in all this gold leaf and golden glorious things. And she climbed all the stairs up to the top of the palace and put him into a giant chalice filled with the finest wines. I don't know what you would do with like with these babies. Like it's filled. No. She wrapped him with cloths and put him into a manger, a feed trough. And why were they there? Because they were too low to even be able to get a guest room. Because there was no room available for them. And this is such a beautiful story because it's meeting that fall of David, meeting right here with the beginning of Jesus. And it goes forward there. And I got one more big idea for you. And I have a fun one. You ready? Well, this isn't the fun one. We're going to get to it. But when Jesus lives his life, shows us the kingdom of God, and we see that our own sin caused all the hurt and pain, right? That my own sin put him there on the cross, and he dies on the cross. And when he dies, they put him in the tomb. And how long did he spend in the tomb? 3 days, right? 3 days. Is that a connection to the 3 days that David decided, it's not like, I'm not going to be a shepherd anymore. We're going to have pestilence and lose 70,000 people all around here. But Jesus, rather than all the hurt and the pain of our sin and all the animosity and the grief and the shame that we all feel ourselves, Jesus took it all with himself to the grave, where he was part of the grave for 3 days, that he was the good shepherd and took all of that off of us. Now we're going to have a little bit of theological fun here, all right? Just real fast. I've always heard, I hear this every Easter, someone will come up to me. Someone, I'm not going to look at anyone specific. It's different every year. It's different people every year. Will come to me, they're like, why do we say he was in the tomb for 3 days? Like that's what I hear all the time, right? Why was he in the tomb for 3 days? Like, do you know? Because they count. You're like, well, Friday to Saturday night, that's one. Sunday morning, that's like 1.5, Pastor, right? Like I hear this from people all the time. And we're like, well, you count the nights and like all that stuff. But I'm wondering, and this isn't, I can't get any foundation to this. This is just fun theology, okay? But when David chose the 3 days of plague, remember the angel relented before the 3 days was done. Is that a subtle nod to when Jesus rises out of the tomb? That God is relenting and bringing in that Easter morning with flowers and blooms and good news coming out of the tomb. I don't know. But I do have a strong hunch that it's all connected now. So I want to say just 3 little sentences as we go. Well, 4. The first one is Merry Christmas, right? The second one is this rise and fall. This is how Jesus works, and this is how Jesus saves us. Number 3, and that is the story of David in Samuel. And 4, I think that's good news. And we'll end right there. Let's say a prayer. Jesus, we thank you that you love us, that you're always with us. Lord, that we see how your Christmas story ties so closely to these huge narratives. We are so grateful for everything that you bring us. And Lord, when we feel like we have to lift ourselves up, Lord, help us to see how you came into the very bottom so none of us would be left behind. Thank you, Jesus. Amen. Thank you so